Welcome to Fisher Webinars. The following is a recording of Is India the Next China? Originally recorded on Thursday, February 21st, 2019.
And welcome to all of you joining today's webinar. Many of you are regular guests to our webinar, but we also have some new people attending for the first time. And for the benefit of those, just a few words about Fisher and Fisher, what we do. We are a information services and management consulting firm offering pulp and paper businesses better performance through strategic use of business intelligence. And we've been doing this for about 30 years, and we work globally, from China to the US, from Brazil up to Finland. Let's get started on the session today. We have all been spoiled since a number of years with China being a growth engine for the pulp and paper industry. Growth is slowly starting to come down. It's not as big as it used to be, and we may see some further decline of the growth in China. So now the interesting question is, of course, can somebody take over after China as the growth engine that we need in this industry? And that's the topic of today's webinar. China and India together stand for more than a third of the total population in the world. China is today slightly bigger than India, but India is growing at the faster rate the population is. So just in a few years, India will actually take over as the number one country in the world as far as population goes, and there will be a decline forecasted for China and population. India is, of course, today already a big economy, but many of you do not know that India is expected to pass the US as the second largest economy in a couple of years from now. The chart you see here is for 2030, and here you can see India is clearly number two after China at that time. Today, India is the number 5 paper producing country in the world, but it's actually only 4% of the total global production. And compared to China, it's about 12% of what China produces today. So this is the starting position, you could say. Where is India today? The consumption of paper in India is showing a strong growth. As you can see at the bottom chart here, we have a CAGR on demand from 2008 to 2016 of more than 6%. So very healthy growth of demand, but it's starting from a very low level. The top chart here shows you the per capita consumption, and India has a consumption of only 13 kilo. That is rather low because the global average is 57 and China is at 74. US at the top is more than 200 kilos. So it's a very low level, but a healthy growth rate. And that is needed, of course, in order to get that number to be of any significant size. This chart shows the GDP per capita for the two countries, China and India. And interesting is that if you look at 2017, in 2017, India reached a global GDP that corresponds to what China had 10 years earlier. So basically, India is 10 years behind China on GDP per capita. And moving forward now, how much of China's path over the last 10 years will India be able to follow? And especially, will they be able to repeat the tremendous paper capacity growth that we've seen in China? Again, on this chart, the bigger bars, the green ones, that's China, and the red ones are India. And you can see that if we look at this now, then the comparison between where India is today and where China was 10 years ago is India is not even close to being where China was 10 years ago. So in spite of what we looked at before, where the GDP basically corresponds to a 10-year, the Chinese number 10 years ago, on paper capacity, it's not 10 years. It's more likely 20 years, or even more than 20 years ago. That's the, we need to go that far back in order to get where India is today, basically on total paper production. So there is some catch up to do here. And is that possible? Both countries have a lot of similarities, as we're going to see in this presentation. There are also a number of differences, and some are very important in order to understand the total picture here. But similar is, of course, that both countries started their journey in the paper industry with a lot of small machines, not making too many tons. The Indian capacity is growing actually for all major grades, and you can see that here. It's quite some healthy percentages. And even the publication grades, meaning printing and writing and newsprint, is growing, which is, of course, somewhat surprising, knowing how that has declined over the last years in North America, Europe, and other parts of the world. But that is still on a growth trajectory in India. Let's talk about the urban population. And urban population and its share of the total population is a good indicator because it's strongly correlated to paper consumption per capita. Basically, the higher share of your population that live in urban areas, the higher your paper consumption is going to be. And this talks for India having a brighter future too for paper. We have a population growth in the urban areas, meaning cities, that is steady. So people are moving from the countryside into the cities, but it still is, compared with the other big countries you can see on this chart, a rural country. It's only a third of the population that live in urban areas. There are multiple demand drivers that are driving the demand growth in China. I mean, in India, excuse me. There's growing wealth with rising income levels, growing expenditure per capita, and a larger percentage of the population that's actually earning money. That's the foundation for the overall demand growth. And then if you look at packaging, I mean, we have requirement of better quality packaging from consumer goods companies, especially those, if you see modern retail growing, that is a strong triggering for good quality packaging. Printing and writing is actually benefiting from the improved literacy rates in India. It's a little bit of a success story in India that literacy is improving, and more people are going to schools. There's actually a higher number of schools and colleges now, and it keeps on growing. That drives consumption of printing and writing. Newsprint consumption is also linked to literacy rates. India is unique in the world because it's one of the few countries actually where you have an increased circulation of newspapers and magazines, and also increasing numbers of them. We expect the growth of printing and writing and newsprint to continue for a few more years. But the substitution by e-media will, of course, also happen in India. and we'll, in a longer time perspective, start to see a decline in India, but not for the moment and not for the very near future. Both India and China are big exporting countries, and manufacturing is very important in China, as we know. I mean, basically it's the workshop for the world. So a lot of goods are produced in China, a lot of goods that goes on export, and the export industry drives China's need and demand of quality packaging to a much larger extent than in India. India's paper industry, you can say, is more there to take care of the domestic demand. So India has a growing demand, and its local industry, paper industry, is not able to meet that demand today. So India needs to import quite a lot of paper today. It's about 2.5 million tons annually right now, and that corresponds to about 14% on top of their production that they do within the country. The top countries exporting to India is Russia. Maybe surprising, at least was surprising to me before. I didn't expect them to be number one here. And then we have China, South Korea, and then we have the guys you would expect here, Canada, US, and Indonesia. The majority of the imports is actually publication paper. That means newsprint and printing and writing, as you can see here per country. That is what dominates the import grade. And over time, as we said, that will the need for this will likely decrease, and that's going to hit the import numbers too. This curve shows from 2012 to the end of last year, import and export. And if you look at this one, we can see, first of all, we have there we are. We have a growing trend on both the import and the export lines. So steady over time. But we also have something very important that happened here at the beginning of last year. We had a sharp decrease of imports before it started to pick up again, and we had an increase of export. And what is this, and why is it showing like that? That's actually linked to the ban of waste paper into China. Because China, as you know, introduced tough restrictions on what they wanted to import as far as waste paper goes. So suddenly there was a bigger supply of waste paper for other countries at very good prices, and India took advantage of that and increased their imports of waste paper, and that led to that they could produce more domestically of paper, and they had a less of a need of importing paper. At the same time, they had some excess paper too that they could start to export. India is the most fragmented major global market in the world. Its market is highly fragmented, and that is characteristic of a growth market. You can see on this chart here that the top 3 paper producers in India only has about 9% capacity share. And compare that with what you have in Indonesia, the US, Japan, and China, you can see a big difference. And this chart here, looking at containerboard producers in India, very clearly shows too that fragmentation actually has increased. Over the last 10 years, the number of containerboard producers have more than quadrupled. So fragmentation is getting worse. And that is because the market is still growing. So Indian consolidation has not really started yet. And fragmentation may actually increase during a growth phase that we are in right now, as even more players enter. Once the growth slows down and there is no new capacity built, and consolidation normally happens with mergers and acquisitions. New, large, and competitive capacities will also contribute to consolidation because they're going to force the smaller, inefficient producers out of the business. Looking at China, we're seeing something very interesting there, and that is that consolidation in China is going very fast for the moment, and it's driven largely by the government imposing stricter environmental legislation, forcing smaller polluting producers to close. So in a way, you can, if you look at this historically, you can say the consolidation in China is now on going faster than it did in the US, because there it was driven by other things, and in Europe. If you look at India now, we're not really seeing this on a large scale in India yet, that the government is imposing stricter environmental legislation. But there are signs for it, and I think we will see that starting to pick up. Just a few interesting pieces about the Indian industry structure. The paper industry is operating in clusters that are driven very much by availability of water and raw material. The left map here shows that the installed capacity, the majority of the installed capacity, about 70%, is placed along the coast, the west and the east coast of India. The right map here shows that we have a clear difference between the southeast down here and the northwest up here when it's about fiber. Up in the northeast, they are very dependent on waste paper and agriculture residues as their fiber. It means bagasse, wheat straw, rice husk, things like that. And down in the other side of India, sort of the southeastern part, they are more focused on wood and bamboo. So this is a regional difference that's significant. More than 80% of Indian paper mills are privately owned. This is in strong contrast to China. When China started on their growth path, then most mills in China were state-owned, and the shift to private and public ownership came around the turn of the century. So here we have a difference between the two countries. We also have an interesting chart here that shows that Indian paper mills are rather small. And the structure of this graph actually corresponds very much to the way China looked 20 years ago. And what does this chart show? It shows the mill size down at the bottom in the different sizes of the mills. The line shows how many sites you have that operate in each of those sizes. And the bar shows then what is the total production. And here you can then clearly see that most mills are very small in India. We're down here to 20 to 40,000 tons, but so they stand for a lot of the production in the country too. And since this chart excludes smaller machines, and when I say small machines, I really mean small machines. Machines smaller than 50 short tons per day. And for specialty and tissue, we would even say smaller than 30 short tons per day. So those are not picked up in this chart. That means that here, if you would look at the first bar, this bar is actually has a lot of additional mills that we may have a couple of 100 to 300 mills that have a size between 5 to 15,000 tons per year. And in this presentation, as we move on now, and when we refer to larger machines, we mean then machines that at least need to produce 50 short tons per day. But overall, this is a picture that's very similar to what we had in China in the past. So, an interesting question. Let's try to figure out how many new machines we could expect in India, assuming that demand growth would be met by local production instead of import. You always have that choice, of course. Do I import or do I produce locally? And we're going to make the assumption that we produce locally instead of importing, because basically there is no reason why it shouldn't be possible to make this in India. I mean, we have a big labor force, low-cost labor, and China has proven that you can build the paper industry by import of fiber at low cost. So why shouldn't India be able to do that as well? China's large machines, and large again, remember that's what I explained on the chart before, excludes these very, very small machines, doubled in 10 years. From 2007 to 2018, they went from about 1,400 to more than 3,000 machines in that time period. Can India now do the same with local production? And of course, you can play this with many different number games and scenarios and so on. I'm going to do this by just assuming that I have a continued robust GDP per capita and population growth in India, and that is resulting in an annual demand growth of 6.5%. Remember from one of the first slides, that is the demand growth that we have seen over the last 8 years as a CAGR. So assuming those numbers, we will then have a demand growth initially of 1.2 million tons per year. And as we move on, I mean, that number is going to grow, of course, then over the 10-year period. And if I then just play the numbers and take an average machine size of 30,000 tons, that would then need 40 new machines per year in order to meet that demand growth, assuming that they would not meet demand growth by import, rather by domestic production. And over a 10-year period, the numbers add up then to around 530 additional machines. And as you can see on the chart down here, that actually is then, this is where India is now. It's about 500 machines actually, so that is a doubling of the number of machines. The overall number is still far behind China's, of course, but the rate of growing is the same in this example here. India's machines are old today, much older than China's, really highlighting India's need also of modernization of their asset base. On this graph, dark green being China, light green being India, shows the number of machines built within a certain time period. And more than half of all paper machines in India that are up and running today were actually built in the last 10 years. Or to be more exact, were built in the last 8 years, because we're on the beginning of 2019 now. So a big replacement has been going on in China. If I look at India instead and start to add up the bars here, I find that more than half of all the paper machines in India that they are operating today, they were built before year 2000. So here we can see a big gap between these two countries. But China is, as we said, probably 20 years ahead of India right now as far as the development goes for the paper industry. If you look at paper machine suppliers in the both countries, and just look at the share of the number of paper machines installed, we see that in both countries you have a lot of different suppliers, and that Western suppliers, if I can call them like that would be people like Voigt and Valmet and Andritz. They are having just a minor share of the market. And look at the number of machines here. But interestingly enough, in India, for whatever reason, we have them almost with a share that is twice as high as we have in China, 17% in India, and it's 9% in China. And that would be an interesting thing to understand, really, why is that? And moving forward now in India, would the Western suppliers being able to maintain that high percentage moving on? That means they would be able to do better in India than what they did in China. If I would do this chart, I could also do it as percentage of the total installed capacity. The numbers for Voigt and Valmet, the Western parts, would go up. The shares would go up, but they still would not be the dominating ones. They tend to build bigger machines, so they would have a bigger share of the installed capacities. Fiber supply, it's a bottleneck for India, the same way as it is for China. There's no really big differences for them there. India is fully dependent on imports to secure its fiber needs. There are forest plantations in India. They are growing in importance, but it's still small scale, and it's unable to produce enough wood to meet the demand that they would have in that country. The pulp production today is rather small. It's less than 4 million tons, and it's meeting only half of the country's need. The other half of the market pulp needs to be imported. Waste paper collection rates are very low in India, which makes the country a big waste paper importer as well. So this is actually not that different from China. So again, we have similarities between the countries here. 70% of the furnish used in India is recycled furnish. Interesting is to see the importance of the non-wood fibers. In producing the chemical pulp, it's about 40% of the fiber used are actually non-wood, which brings quality issues too. It's China had a lot of this, and it's moving away from it because it's easier to maintain the quality aspects if you are able to work with wood. This chart shows the waste paper imports. We said that they are dependent on waste papers, so it's interesting to see what they import. And 80% of what they import is mixed paper and OCC. And the US stands for about half of that imports. So US is a very important supplier of waste paper for India. Interestingly enough is again what has happened now because of what China did. So India has now been very impacted by the Chinese decision on waste paper restrictions, import restrictions. As that happened, a lot of waste paper suddenly were available at very good prices, and the imports to India just skyrocketed then. They quadrupled in a number of months. They came down after that because they were overstocked then, but they are on a clearly higher level now importing waste paper than they were before. And this is something that was only made possible by China's new restriction. So everything that happens in India is obviously not something that they are in total control of themselves. This is an example of where they opportunistically are taking advantage of decision made other places. Environmental issues are big issues in all parts of the world, and India and China have big issues with this. I mean, we have a big high water risk in both India and China, as you can see here. This is as defined by the World Resources Institute, and as you may know, they look at water risk in different facets. One is the availability of water, one deals with the quality of the water, and also the risk for regulation. And these are the numbers for India, and they're quite high. It varies across the country, of course. The dark red is where the water issue is really critical. The best parts is where we have most of the production, which is along the coast. Relatively few mills up to now have been forced to close by government mandate relating to water risk in India. But with the increasing cost of environmental compliance that we see in India and stricter governmental enforcement, like what we have seen in China recently, force an increasing number of mill closures. I think yes. Looking at greenhouse gases, carbon footprint, India has a big problem, and so does China. This chart here shows the top 12 producers of paper in the world, and China and India have the highest carbon footprint. That is driven very much by the extensive use of fossil fuel, in particular coal. That's about half of India's use. China has a very similar problem, but what we see in China is that there are some very active steps to reduce its coal dependency and replacing coal with gas over time here. So the problem is being addressed probably faster right now than it's being addressed in India. Foreign direct investment has so far been low in India, but as we're going to see here, there is an enormous investment project on the horizon being planned right now. The current foreign investment is limited to a very small number, about 400,000 tons. It's Westrock and International Paper that are active. So far, foreign direct investment has not really been driving capacity growth in India. And one has to say too, it's difficult to find attractive mills to acquire since the mill size is so small in India and the asset-based quality is poor. But now we have this huge announcement from APMP planning a 5 million ton greenfield project. That would be by far the single largest foreign direct investment. And by any way of comparing, this is a huge undertaking, a huge project. We're talking about an investment of $3.5 billion US. We're talking about an annual capacity of 5 million tons. The concept is that virgin pulp would be sourced from Indonesia, from their own pulp mills in Indonesia, and waste paper would be sourced globally. The production at this site would replace all the imports that APMP today, or let's turn it around, all the export that APMP has today to India from their Chinese and Indonesian mills. But it would also be a foundation for export out of India. So not only for domestic production. Big project. It's going through a phase now where it's being checked, reviewed by the authorities, and a clearance is expected at the end of this year. But since it's such a big project, it's may happen that the project will be scaled back. But even if you scale back a project of this size, you're going to have a tremendously big investment in new capacity. And could this possibly be a blueprint for other large-scale foreign direct investments from, for example, Chinese companies in line with their global expansion plans? We've seen recently over the last couple of years, Chinese companies expanding abroad, not only in North America, also in Europe, in Asia. And this could be a very interesting opportunity for these big Chinese players, or for Latin American companies heavy in forest and pulp, interesting in some forward integration for their pulp. If that project goes through, gets approved, it will put a lot of pressure on non-competitive sites, and a number of players we expect would be forced to close down. This is a viability benchmark curve that deals with the mid and long-term asset competitiveness, and it takes into account not only cost but also size, capital requirements, productivity, and technical age. Let's try to summarize what we talked about so far. India is well positioned for big growth and faces similar changes as China did when China started on their growth path. Macroeconomic factors such as population and GDP growth indicate that the Indian paper industry could be poised for strong growth. Many of the challenges that we see in India today that they have are actually challenges that China had when they started or still have. A lot of small mills, outdated technology, predominantly from local suppliers, a high dependency on import of fiber, both market pulp and waste paper, environmental issues like water risk and overall pollution. China was able to, in spite of their weak starting position, to grow to be the undisputed global paper industry leader. So what does this mean? Does this really mean that India could replicate the speed and scale of China's success? Probably not, in my opinion. And why is that? I think if we look at the difference between the countries and what they've done so far, we have to look at their political systems partly. China and India, they had up to the early 80s, mid 80s, similar GDP and export strength. But at that time, China initiated a very strong top-down shift and redirection of the whole national economy, including heavy investments in infrastructure. India has a complete different situation. It's a non-centralized big democracy, so their economic and political structure will make a similar change initiative, even if the ambition level would be there, would be more difficult and it would need a longer time period. So a non-centralized versus a centralized economy. It's a big difference. But nevertheless, Indian paper industry investments will offer attractive opportunities, although at a smaller scale than what we have seen in China, but it's still quite attractive. India now is entering a period of stronger growth. There will be a need for increased imports and investments, especially in fiber and bigger machines with more advanced technology. The number of new larger machines needed for the coming 10-year period, assuming that we have a continued demand growth, which we've had now for quite a while in India, and that demand growth will be met by domestic production rather than import, then we are seeing then over the coming 10-year period 500 to 700 new machines, more than double the current number. Of course, the number of machines at the end of the day depends on what grades you have, and also on the plus side here is, will India be able to replace the imports that they have? Not only slow down the growth of the imports, but to replace it with domestically produced material, then you would be on the higher side of the machine number. Greenfield investments in India can be very attractive, and we can see that there is at least one player that's seeing that now, and that is APMP. And why is it attractive with big greenfield investments? I mean, you have a growing domestic market, but you also have the opportunity to capture share from the imports, and you could use the country and your investment as a base for export out of India. And APMP, as we said, it's the benchmark project that everybody's looking at right now to see if that is approved and if they are successful going forward with that. We believe that India can be attractive also for Chinese producers with global expansion strategies, and Latin American pulp producers that like to secure their future through forward integration. Investors and suppliers, in order to be successful, they need additional insights, of course, a number of questions that you need to answer. Who are the winning horses that I should ally with? I mean, right now it's hard, if you look at the local players, to pick winners. It's always hard if you have that type of fragmentation. We also know that not all FDIs are successful, but it's a question you need to answer. Who are the horses I should bet on? And how will the market changes play out depending on the state, the region, the different grades, the companies, etc. What new machines are most likely needed as far as the size goes, as technology goes. Interesting for the Western suppliers, of course, could I in India do something differently so that I could secure a bigger share of that growth opportunity than what happened in China, actually, where you in some way can say that probably didn't reap all the potential opportunity that they could have gotten. And do I understand India's internal markets, its infrastructure, its water availability, etc., in order to compete in a good way? These are all questions that are important. And if you're interested to discuss this more, talk to us at Fisher, and let's see if there is a way that we can help you to answer your questions.